I never imagined that buying a ranch for $1 would lead me to uncover a family secret that had been buried for 40 years. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button while you're here. Tomorrow, I'm dropping a story that's going to blow your mind. The auction listing seemed like a joke at first. Failing Cattle Ranch, 200 acres in Montana, starting bid $1. I was scrolling through estate sale websites at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep in my cramped studio apartment above a laundromat in Seattle. At 23 years old, I was working two jobs, barely making rent, and wondering if this was all my life would ever be. The ranch photos showed a property that had seen better days. The main house leaned slightly to the left, its paint peeling in long strips. The barn roof sagged in the middle, and the fences were held together more by hope than actual structural integrity. But there was something about it that called to me. Maybe it was the way the mountains rose up behind the property, or the vast emptiness that promised space to breathe, or maybe it was just desperation for something different. The listing explained that the ranch had belonged to a woman named Dorothy Harper, who died 6 months earlier at 91 years old with no living relatives. The county had taken possession of the property for unpaid taxes, and they were auctioning it off to recoup their losses. The catch was that the buyer would be responsible for $18,000 in back taxes, plus whatever it cost to make the place livable again. I had $700 in my savings account, but I couldn't stop thinking about that ranch. I'd grown up in foster care after my mother disappeared when I was 5, bouncing between homes until I aged out at 18. I'd never had anything that was truly mine, never had a place where I could put down roots and build something permanent. This ranch, broken and desperate as it was, represented possibility. 3 days before the auction, I made a decision that everyone told me was insane. I quit both my jobs, packed everything I owned into my 15-year-old Honda, and drove 20 hours to Montana. I had no plan beyond showing up to that auction and hoping for a miracle. The county courthouse in Millbrook, Montana, was a small brick building that looked like it hadn't changed since 1950. I arrived an hour early, my stomach churning with nervousness. The auction was being held in a basement room that smelled like old paper and floor wax, with about 15 metal folding chairs facing a podium. Only 3 other people showed up. An elderly man in overalls, who looked like he might be a neighboring rancher, sat in the front row. Behind him was a young couple wearing matching fleece vests, the kind of people who probably watched a lot of home renovation shows and thought they could flip the property. And then there was me, wearing my nicest jeans and a sweater I'd borrowed from my roommate, pretending I belonged there. The auctioneer was a tired-looking woman named Margaret, who clearly wanted to get this over with. She explained the terms quickly. Minimum bid $1, but the winning bidder would assume responsibility for all debts and taxes associated with the property. The ranch was being sold as is, with no guarantees or warranties. "Do I hear $1? Margaret asked, sounding bored. The old man raised his hand. $1. $2, the fleece vest husband called out. My heart pounded. $5. The couple exchanged glances and shook their heads. The old man looked at me with something like pity and said, "It's all yours, young lady. That place is more trouble than it's worth." And just like that, I owned a ranch for $5. Margaret handed me a stack of paperwork that felt 3 inches thick. I signed documents I barely understood, trying not to think about the $18,000 I now owed the county. She explained that I had 90 days to pay the back taxes, or the property would be seized and resold. Good luck, she said, and it didn't sound encouraging. I drove out to the ranch that same afternoon, following directions on my phone down increasingly remote roads until I turned onto a gravel driveway, marked by a weathered sign that read Harper Ranch, with several letters missing. The house looked even worse in person, but the land itself was beautiful. Rolling hills covered in dried grass, clusters of pine trees, and a view that stretched for miles. The front door wasn't locked. Inside, the house was frozen in time, like Dorothy Harper had just stepped out and planned to return any minute. Furniture from the 1970s filled the rooms, covered in a thick layer of dust. The kitchen had avocado green appliances and yellowed linoleum floors. Family photos lined the hallway, showing a younger Dorothy with a husband and a little girl, all of them smiling in front of this same house when it was new and proud. I spent that first night on an ancient couch, wrapped in a sleeping bag I'd brought from Seattle, listening to the house settle and creak around me. I had no heat, no food, and no idea what I was going to do. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. The next morning, I started exploring the property. The barn was my main concern. If I was going to make this work, I needed to assess what could be salvaged and what was beyond repair. The building was massive, probably built in the 1920s, with hand-hewn beams and a loft that had once stored hay. Now it stored mostly cobwebs and bird nests. The stable area took up the back third of the barn, with 6 stalls that hadn't housed horses in decades. The concrete floor was cracked and uneven, and several of the stall doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. I was making notes on my phone about repairs when I noticed something odd. One section of the floor in the last stall sounded hollow when I walked on it. I stamped my foot a few times, listening to the echo. Definitely hollow. I found a crowbar in a pile of tools and started prying at the concrete, which broke away easily, revealing old wooden planks underneath. The wood was rotten in places, and I pulled away chunks until I'd created an opening about 3 feet across. Below was a space, maybe 4 feet deep, and inside that space was a metal box. My hands shook as I reached down and pulled it out. The box was heavy, about the size of a small suitcase, with a padlock that had rusted through. One good hit with the crowbar and it fell open. Inside were bundles of cash, lots of cash. I sat down hard on the stable floor, staring at the money in disbelief. The bills were old, mostly 20s and 50s, wrapped in rubber bands that crumbled when I touched them. There had to be thousands of dollars here, maybe tens of thousands. Beneath the cash were documents, property deeds, bank statements, and letters written in shaky handwriting. I pulled out one of the letters and started reading. "To whoever finds this," it began, "my name is Dorothy Harper, and if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've bought my ranch. I'm sorry for the state I've left it in. I'm sorry for a lot of things." The letter went on to explain that Dorothy had hidden the money 25 years ago, in 1999, after her husband died. They'd never trusted banks after losing everything in the farm crisis of the 80s, so they'd kept their savings in cash, buried under the stable floor where no one would think to look. I meant to use this money to fix up the ranch and pay off the debts, Dorothy wrote. But after my husband passed and my daughter left, I just couldn't find the energy anymore. Every year I told myself I'd do it next year, but next year never came. Now I'm 86 years old. My mind isn't what it used to be, and I'm afraid I'll forget where I hid this. So I'm writing it down. She explained that the money should be used to save the ranch, to restore it to what it had been when her family was happy there. She also wrote about her daughter, Sarah, who'd left Montana at 18 and never came back. Sarah and I fought before she left, Dorothy wrote. She wanted to pursue her art, and I told her she was being foolish, that she should stay and help run the ranch. I said terrible things, and she left angry. I tried to find her over the years, but she'd changed her name and didn't want to be found. I hope she's happy wherever she is. I hope she knows I loved her, even when I was too stubborn to show it. The letter ended with instructions. Use the money for the ranch. Make it beautiful again. Build something that lasts. I counted the cash 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. $47,000, more than enough to pay the back taxes and start repairs. But something about the letter bothered me. Dorothy's daughter Sarah had left and changed her name. That felt personal, significant. I started going through the other documents in the box. There were old photos of Sarah as a child and teenager, always looking slightly uncomfortable in front of the camera. And there was a newspaper clipping from 2008, yellowed and fragile. The headline read, "Local artist Sarah Wells dies in car accident." My blood ran cold as I read the article. Sarah Wells, formerly Sarah Harper, had died in Seattle at age 42, leaving behind a 5-year-old daughter. The daughter's name wasn't mentioned. Sarah Wells. Sarah Harper. My mother's name was Sarah Wells. I'd spent my entire childhood being told that my mother had no family, that I'd ended up in foster care because there was no one else. But my mother had grown up here, on this ranch. Dorothy Harper was my grandmother. What comes next changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Stay with me and make sure you hit subscribe. I sat in that stable for hours, surrounded by cash and revelations, trying to piece together a history I'd never known existed. My mother had left this ranch at 18, changed her name, and built a life in Seattle. She'd become an artist like she'd always wanted, but she'd also cut ties with her family so completely that when she died, no one thought to look for relatives in Montana. The realization hit me in waves. I'd bought my own family's ranch without knowing it. I'd driven 20 hours and bid $5 on my grandmother's property. If the universe had a sense of humor, this was it. Dark, twisted, and somehow perfect. I pulled out my phone and started searching. It took time and several dead ends, but I eventually found Dorothy Harper's obituary from 6 months ago. It mentioned that she was predeceased by her husband Thomas and her daughter Sarah, and that she had no surviving family, which meant Dorothy had learned about my mother's death probably years after it happened, and had died knowing she had a granddaughter somewhere out there that she'd never met. I thought about all those years I'd spent in foster care, moving from home to home, never feeling like I belonged anywhere. And the whole time, I'd had a grandmother in Montana who would have wanted me. The system had failed us both so completely that we'd lived and died as strangers, connected by blood, but separated by bureaucracy and bad luck. The anger came first, hot and sharp, directed at no one and everyone. At my mother for cutting ties so completely. At Dorothy for being too proud to push harder to reconcile. At the social workers who'd processed my mother's death without digging deep enough to find family. At myself for not knowing, for not somehow sensing that I had roots somewhere. But the anger faded into something softer. Grief, maybe, for the relationship we'd never had. For the childhood I could have spent on this ranch instead of in group homes. For the grandmother who died alone, probably thinking about the granddaughter she'd lost. The county records office had more information. When Dorothy died, they'd tried to locate next of kin but couldn't find anyone. Sarah had changed her name and moved away, and I'd been lost in the foster system under a different last name. My father's name, before he'd left when I was 2. There was no paper trail connecting me to Dorothy Harper or this ranch. We'd been invisible to each other, separated by something as simple as different last names and poor record keeping. I spent the next 3 days going through everything in the house, looking for more pieces of my family's story. In Dorothy's bedroom, I found boxes of my mother's artwork from high school, paintings and sketches that showed real talent, the kind of raw creativity that needed to be nurtured and developed. No wonder she'd wanted to leave and pursue art. This ranch, as beautiful as it was, must have felt like a cage to someone with her gifts. There were watercolors of the mountains at sunset, charcoal drawings of horses in the pasture, and abstract pieces that seemed to pulse with emotion I couldn't quite name. My mother had been talented, genuinely gifted, and I'd never known. The scraps of her art I remembered from childhood, the quick sketches she'd made to entertain me, had been just a shadow of what she could do. I also found letters Dorothy had written but never sent, addressed to Sarah, in care of various art galleries and schools in Seattle. Please come home. I'm sorry for what I said. I miss you every day. She'd tried to reach out, tried to apologize, but pride or fear had kept her from actually mailing the letters. Reading those unsent letters broke something open inside me. Dorothy had been just as trapped by the estrangement as my mother had been. She'd wanted to fix things but hadn't known how, and the years had slipped away until it was too late. It was a specific kind of tragedy, the kind where everyone involved wanted the same thing, but no one knew how to bridge the gap. In one box, I found photos I recognized. A little girl at a birthday party, maybe 4 years old, wearing a purple dress and a lopsided crown. That was me. My mother must have sent these to Dorothy, keeping some connection even if they weren't speaking. Dorothy had kept every photo, every Christmas card, storing them carefully in a cedar chest like treasures. There were pictures of me at ages I barely remembered. First day of kindergarten, holding my mother's hand and smiling nervously at the camera. Halloween, dressed as a ladybug, playing in a park somewhere in Seattle, my hair wild and my face full of joy. My mother had documented my childhood and sent proof of my existence to the grandmother I'd never met. I cried for hours that night, mourning the family I'd never known I had. Dorothy and I could have known each other. She could have taken me in after my mother died, instead of me ending up in foster care. But the system had failed us both, and by the time Dorothy might have learned about me, it was too late. The money from the hidden box gave me options. I paid off the back taxes the next week, and suddenly the ranch was truly mine, free and clear. I hired a local contractor named James to assess the house and barn, giving me a realistic estimate of what repairs would cost. "You're looking at about 20,000 to make the house livable," James said, walking through the rooms with a clipboard. "New roof, updated electrical, fixing the foundation. The barn needs less work structurally, but you'll want to reinforce those beams before winter. Figure another 8,000 there." I could afford it. I could actually afford to fix this place. Over the next 3 months, the ranch transformed. The house got a new roof and fresh paint, soft yellow with white trim like it had been in the old photos. We gutted the kitchen and bathroom, installing modern plumbing and appliances while keeping the original layout Dorothy would have known. The barn received new support beams and a patched roof, and I hired someone to repair the fences around the property. The work was hard and slow. There were days when I questioned everything, when the enormity of what I'd taken on felt crushing. I'd lie awake at night in my sleeping bag, listening to contractors arrive at dawn, and wonder if I was completely insane. A 23-year-old with no ranching experience, no family, and no backup plan, trying to resurrect a property that had defeated my grandmother. But there were also good days, days when the sun hit the mountains just right, and I understood why my grandparents had built their life here. Days when a repair went smoothly or I figured out how to fix something myself. Days when I felt my grandmother's presence in the house, almost like she was guiding my hands. Word spread through Millbrook about the young woman who'd bought the Harper Ranch for $5. People were curious and surprisingly helpful. The old man from the auction, whose name was Robert, stopped by one afternoon with a casserole and advice about winterizing the property. "Dorothy was a good woman," he said, sitting on my newly repaired porch. "Stubborn as hell, but good. She loved this land. I'm glad someone's bringing it back to life." I didn't tell him I was Dorothy's granddaughter. Not at first. I wasn't sure how to explain that I'd bought my own family's property without knowing it was mine. But eventually the truth came out, the way truth always does in small towns. I was at the feed store buying supplies when the cashier, a woman named Linda who'd known Dorothy for 40 years, commented on how much I looked like Sarah Harper. "It's uncanny," she said, studying my face. "You've got her eyes and the same stubborn chin. Are you related?" I could have denied it, but I was tired of secrets. Sarah was my mother. Linda's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, honey, Dorothy talked about you. Once she found out Sarah had died and left a daughter, she tried so hard to find you. But you'd been in foster care under a different name, and the system wouldn't give her information. She was heartbroken. Learning that Dorothy had tried to find me shifted something inside. She hadn't abandoned me. She'd simply run out of time. Linda told me more, details that made my grandmother real in ways the letters and photos couldn't. How Dorothy had spent the last years of her life calling social services offices, hiring a private investigator who came up empty, even putting ads in Seattle newspapers, hoping I might see them. She'd exhausted every avenue she could think of, but the privacy laws protecting foster children had also protected me from being found. "She died hoping you were happy somewhere," Linda said, squeezing my hand across the counter. "She'd be so glad to know you ended up here anyway, taking care of her ranch. It's like the land called you home." The community embraced me after that. People who'd known my grandmother and my mother shared stories that painted a fuller picture of my family. I learned that Thomas Harper, my grandfather, had been a gentle giant who could calm any horse and fix any engine, that Dorothy had been a fierce advocate for rural education, serving on the school board for 20 years, that my mother had been talented but restless, always drawing in the margins of her notebooks and dreaming of bigger things than Montana offered. I decided to honor them all by making the ranch successful again. I didn't have experience with cattle or horses, but I learned. Robert became an unofficial mentor, teaching me about land management and animal husbandry. I started small, with a dozen chickens and a vegetable garden, then gradually added goats and eventually a few head of cattle. I also converted the barn's loft into an art studio, installing skylights and building proper storage for supplies. My mother's dream of being an artist had been cut short, but I could keep that creative spirit alive. I wasn't particularly talented at painting, but I discovered I loved woodworking, creating furniture and decorative pieces from fallen trees on the property. One afternoon, while cleaning out the barn's tack room, I found another box hidden behind old saddles. This one contained my mother's journals from her teenage years. Reading them was like meeting her for the first time as a real person rather than the fragmented memories of a 5-year-old. She wrote about feeling trapped, about arguments with Dorothy over her future, about loving the ranch, but needing to find her own path. She also wrote about me, entries from after I was born that showed how much she'd struggled as a single mother, but how fiercely she'd loved me. Emma is everything, one entry read. She has my stubbornness and her father's laugh, and when she smiles at me, I know I'm doing something right, even when everything else feels wrong. That was my name, Emma. I'd gone by Emily for years after entering foster care because it was easier, less personal. But seeing my real name in my mother's handwriting, surrounded by words of love, made me want to reclaim it. I started introducing myself as Emma again, Emma Harper, embracing both my mother's maiden name and my own identity. People in Millbrook accepted it naturally, as if I'd always been Emma Harper of the Harper Ranch. By the end of my first year in Montana, the ranch was profitable enough to support me without needing another job. I sold eggs and vegetables at the farmer's market, took commissions for custom furniture pieces, and even started offering workshop weekends where people could come learn basic ranching skills. The property that had seemed like such a disaster when I'd bought it for $5 had become a thriving homestead. But more than that, it had become home. Real home, in a way I'd never experienced before. I knew my neighbors. I understood the rhythm of the seasons. I had roots that went deep into this Montana soil, connecting me to a family I'd never met, but whose legacy I was carrying forward. On the anniversary of buying the ranch, I held a small gathering. Robert came, along with Linda from the feed store, James the contractor, and several other people who'd helped me throughout the year. We ate dinner on the porch, watching the sun set over the same mountains my grandparents had watched, and I felt overwhelming gratitude for the series of accidents and tragedies that had led me here. Dorothy would be so proud, Linda said, raising her glass. She always said this land had a way of calling people home. Guess she was right. I thought about the letter Dorothy had left in that metal box, about her hope that someone would restore the ranch and make it beautiful again. I'd done that, but I'd also found something more valuable than the cash she'd hidden. I'd found my history, my family's story, and my own place in the world. Late that night, after everyone had gone home, I walked out to the stable where I'd found the buried box. The floor was repaired now, solid and level, but I remembered that moment of discovery, how my whole life had changed with the crack of a crowbar. I'd come to Montana desperate for something different, willing to risk everything on a $1 ranch that nobody else wanted. And I'd found a family I'd never known I had, a legacy I'd never expected, and a future I was building with my own hands. The ranch had given me more than just property. It had given me a name, a history, and proof that I'd come from people who'd worked hard and loved deeply. Every fence I repaired, every animal I cared for, every piece of furniture I crafted was a tribute to the grandparents I'd never met and the mother I'd barely known. Standing there in the quiet Montana night, surrounded by land that had been in my family for generations, I finally understood what home meant. It wasn't just a place. It was belonging to something bigger than yourself, being part of a story that started before you and would continue after you were gone. Thank you so much for listening to Emma's journey from a $5 auction to discovering her true family legacy. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever discovered something about your family that changed your perspective on your own life? Or maybe you've taken a leap of faith that seemed crazy, but turned out to be exactly what you needed. Share your stories below. Until next time, keep believing that sometimes the best things in life come from the risks nobody else is willing to take. And don't forget to click on one of the 2 stories on your screen for more incredible journeys of discovery and transformation.